Well, hello. I'm Professor Susan Baker from Cardiff University, and I'm sitting here today in this Senate building at the heart of the structure of Welsh governance, speaking to Matthew Quinn, who is the Director of the Environment and Sustainable Development Division within the Welsh Government, and with Professor Terry Marsden, who is the Director of the Sustainable Places Research Institute and also a professor in one of the schools of Cardiff University. So we're sitting here today and we want to talk about the issue of sustainability. We're sitting here in Cardiff, at the heart of a new reorganised city region. And we're also sitting in a Welsh context that has now put itself at the forefront of new legislative developments for sustainability. So I want to start by asking you both to just explain to us what are the issues that you think face us here in a Welsh context, in a global context, in terms of our promotion of sustainable futures. And set the scene for the listener about what you see our challenges as being.
Shall I start?
Yes, please, Terry.
Yeah, well, my commitment here is really in terms of developing sustainability science as an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary endeavour. And in doing that, that's very ambitious, and what it involves is opening the vector of science much more broadly from very rational forms of science or disciplinary forms of science to science which incorporates social science but natural sciences and physical sciences as well, what we might call more than human sciences. And that's a real challenge for us, and that has big implications for the approach we adopt and how practical and applied our science can be. So that's the sort of basis, I think, of where we're moving, and that's part of this is sustainable place making, of thinking about how we can redesign places in a more sustainable way.
Yeah. Matthew?
I guess I've got similar issues within the context of governance and policy from my perspective. So when the Welsh Assembly, the Welsh Government was first established, there was this real desire for it to be a different type of institution, something that embraced particularly the concept of sustainability, and it was one of the few governments that had and legislatures that had sustainability built into its original constitution. And we've had that opportunity now for quite a few years to learn what that means and to develop it and to get that real understanding, similarly to the issue of interdisciplinarity and framing about how you look at government from that perspective, because we do compartmentalise, we do oversimplify, we do deal with issues in isolation, and that ability to find ways of making those connections, of which place is a really important one, I think are very much at the heart of what we've been trying to do in terms of of governance and more recently in terms of legislation.
If we put things together and see them in a systems way, and we start breaking down disciplinary barriers and we start speaking about these social problems or these wicked problems, as sometimes we call them, in ways that isn't necessarily sector specific, is there a danger here that we might become too general? That we might have too broad brush an understanding so that we actually lose the specialisms and the specific knowledge base that we've built up over the past? Is it always good that we have interdisciplinarity? Is it always good that we break down administrative specializations and structures?
I think it's really important that you know your stuff, that you know about the thing you do, but that you don't do that in isolation of everybody else's stuff and the bigger picture. And I think the risk both in the academic context and in the political context is that you get narrowed down into a particular area, you champion that, you know a lot about it, and you champion it against the other issues. It becomes the focus, and you lose why socially it is an important issue in the first place, because these things are all important, but they lose their place within the overall system if you're not careful.
And have you got a similar?
Yes, I think there is a merging of, if we take the social sciences, I think there's a merging of social sciences. I don't think it makes much sense any longer to think about sub-disciplines so much in social sciences, I have to say. And a lot of PhDs now, and we're encouraging it in this consortium and in the institute here, a lot of PhDs are essentially interdisciplinary, perhaps within social sciences or in the sciences in many respects. So I think the basis of science is actually moving in that post-disciplinary way. You've clearly got to know your stuff, and obviously to succeed at PhDs in science, you've got to be rigorous and so on. But I think there is a shift to more interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary science. The second point, I think, what it engenders is that, as Matthew says, you cannot do this on your own. Clearly, academic work is very much individual, but this type of sustainability science can't be done on your own. You need living labs, you need collaborations, both within academia and beyond to do it. So increasingly, it's not an ivory tower pursuit.
Yeah. Collaborations. Are collaborations useful for you? Does the academy have anything to say to public administration?
Yes, it does. It struggles to say it.
Okay.
And we struggle
How do they
to talk,
struggle?
because often it makes abstract things that we think of as concrete. So we're interested in the doing and aren't particularly clear sometimes that we're engaged in a theory. And it's good sometimes that we're told we're engaged in a theory, because we're very good at accidentally engaging three separate theories on one thing without realising it. So it's always good to know what your values are you're taking it. But one of the challenges I think we've got in academia and also in civil society is about how we engage about the whole and the system. So it's very easy to lobby on a narrow topic or to engage on a narrow topic in terms of academia, but increasingly we're needing things that bring things together. A very simple example I've got from some of the monitoring work we're now doing, where previously and typically within the natural sciences you study one thing and collect information and have a time series about that. You very rarely collect the circumstances around that one thing. And one of the things we're increasingly funding is if you're looking at a whole place and you're collecting a whole set of data at the same time around that, so that you can understand the systemic relationships there, not just track the fact that a particular bird species or whatever is going down the pan or not, because it doesn't actually tell you anything about the circumstances surrounding it. So it's a very specific example, but I think it typifies a lot of the work.
Yes, I suppose for us we'd conceive that as looking at something in terms of nested hierarchies.
Essentially.
You know, that we would look at the local, but we'd also try to see the local in a broader context and that in a broader context again. You know, and it is a question of opening up to that broader context, but closing down around the investigation of particular things.
Yes, but also making sure that you're collecting the right particular things, so that you know, in this case, that you're looking at the water and the plants and the species and gathering that information simultaneously in a place context. And we haven't touched on place too much.
We haven't.
Yet,
It's
a
good.
shame.
Yes.
I find it very difficult to conceive of sustainability without thinking of place. Because sustainability is essentially about making connections between things and between different aspects in a more systemic way. And typically in society and in the natural environment, that means places.
Okay, and you're directing a Sustainable Places Research Institute. So what do you mean here by place, and why is place important for sustainability science, but also for addressing these grand challenges that Matthew's been talking about here?
Yeah, I think there is what's called a spatial turn in social sciences, but also wider across the sciences in many respects. That place is it's essentially about extending an ecological metaphor for sustainability in many respects, because it's around place, around different areas that these things are inevitably come together. I mean, the world in reality is not sectoral or pigeonholed. And so when we put together the Institute and the mission of the Institute, it was clear that place became not only a methodological tool, but also an organisational tool to bring different scientists together around looking at particular places. And that means that raises the question then about how do you frame place? And clearly the question of scale comes into this, and one way of doing it is to use concepts like the city region or the community or different. I think it's important to be flexible about the parameters and scales here, actually, and as the 15 researchers that are on this programme demonstrate, they're taking different angles and different framings around questions of place and space. It's also a particular problem in a policy sense, because I know in the Welsh Government sense, in terms of thinking about placemaking, a question is how to optimise that, through, do you take catchments, do you take city regions, do you take villages or existing jurisdictional scales. So this scalar question shouldn't be ignored, but I don't think it should dominate we shouldn't get too rigid about the question of scale in this context, although we have to deal with it.
But the Welsh Government's actually given themselves something else as well, hasn't it? It's given themselves the scalar place dimension, but it's also given themselves the temporal scale, because we have now a well-being of future generations.
Indeed.
So we're talking about both spatial and temporal scale here.
Yes, indeed.
So how does that issue of the temporal scale get put onto our research agenda, and how does it get put onto our policy agenda?
Gosh, well, I'll start with I'm sketching a little bit on the legislation
Yes,
in
please,
a sense.
yeah,
So
yeah.
we've just put in place 2 pieces of legislation relevant to this. One is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which sets 7 wellbeing goals for all the public sector that they must maximise their contribution to, all 7 of them. Simultaneously discussed, and we've also got 5 behaviours, 2 of which were again statutory behaviours, 2 of which long-term and precautionary, preventative. So we've got that opportunity to really change the short-termism that you can see so often within public policy making, by challenging that and saying that the decisions we make today must make a difference in the future. And in terms of space, this piece of legislation plus the Environment Act introduced 2 new spatial tools. We will have statutory wellbeing plans that are at the local authority level, and we will have natural resource area statements about the opportunities within areas which are again likely to be at an administrative area for convenience as much as anything, but we'll capture those elements. And I think that's a really important connection between the drivers of the value drivers for public bodies, but also then making sure that that's being recognised within a spatial context. Okay,
let's leave the values for a moment, because I want to actually come back and ask you about values, but let's just dig a little bit more on the temporal. I can see and we can understand why the spatial scale is important, because we've talked already about nested hierarchies, we've talked about the place context and embedding policy in place and research in place and how that might work. How do we embed the temporal dimension in sustainability science?
Well, that's a really good question, because I think we're at a cusp of needing new theory to look at futures. Clearly we don't want to deny the significance of historical analysis either, but it's quite clear that out there in the real world, in the corporate world, in the finance world, in the investment world, organisations are looking to futures and they're scenario building. And I think part of critical sustainability science is to examine and unravel these new futures and these new virtualisms, and to think through critically what designs, sustainability designs, might work and what might not work. And this is taking us into a really new field. And it's a field where many social scientists have been very timid or critical of in the past. We've been very good at deconstruction. And sustainability actually means we have to reconstruct. And many social scientists and scientists are saying, well, we can't go that far. And I think sustainability science is opening that challenging vector up, actually. And it's saying, well, we're being asked, how will we achieve progress on the 7 principles of the Generations Act in the next 10 years? What's the world going to look like? How can we put into place?
And is 10 years enough? How many generations do we want to go forward? 7 generations into the future?
Well, we're definitely looking at a longer period than that. I mean, this is something around, I think we're looking at initially a generation in terms of 25 years for this. We've given ourselves the duty of a statutory future trends report, so we'll be wanting to draw on a lot of thinking there. I think the key thing for us in a future trends report is that it's something that challenges current orthodoxy, not something that simply projects current orthodoxy forward, so that actually has a sense of genuine changing circumstances and contexts. Because sadly in government a lot of the tools we use are simply projections of current trends, and we are slaves to them in many areas. And I think that ability to rethink possible futures, and I think particularly in the context of carbon, where another part of our legislation is actually to set carbon budgets for the different aspects of society, so that we're working to where we all need to be in policy terms to be a zero carbon.
And that's where academia can make that contribution, because we can look at things like scenario building, forward casting, back casting. But I think, Terry, you're quite right that we've been very timid about giving voice to future generations, because we know that's an unknown, and we're fearful we might foreclose their futures by giving too much voice now to them.
Yeah, I think the other question it raises, and this is why we shouldn't deny our past in social science, or in sciences more generally, from the 19th century when we developed this intellectual division of labour, which is now increasingly defunct. But I think the point is that we're having to come back to some fundamental questions given the sustainability perspective. And those are around the relationship between market, state and society, basically, and civil society, and what the drivers are for delivering on a more sustainable design and sustainable placemaking. So we're going to have to think through critically what sort of new innovations does the state adopt, what new innovations do the private market environments develop, and what's the role particularly for civil society. I mean, my own personal view is that this science should be empowering. We should be empowering people to actually deliver sustainability through their own communities. In a sense, it might be a new liberalism, in a sense, I'm advocating there. But in a sense, it's not going to be delivered by a welfarist top-down policy necessarily. It's going to be delivered through new combinations, variable combinations of state market and civil society relationships. And so, we're not detaching ourselves from some very traditional long-term ideas and concepts in science, but we're actually having to take them into a new era of design.
I do very much confer with that sense of a new contract with civil society and of civil society in a sense. I think we've tried to over-professionalise and take away a lot of, and I think a lot of the work we've been doing around engagement, particularly when you get to the sort of area of co-production, where the act of engaging with people is itself about strengthening them and building capacity. So it's not just a means to an end; it is in itself purposive in engaging with people, and that leads to some interesting issues for ethics and academia, I would imagine, in terms of the actor in there. But certainly for us in government, that advantage of engaging people positively in a way that enables them to find their way to address issues, and to, as I've been doing a number of sessions for our new, relatively new single natural resources Wales that brings together all these aspects, saying leave your white coat at the door. That you have your knowledge, but your knowledge is intimidating and off-putting if you're not very careful, and it closes debate rather than opens debate. And your knowledge is there to strengthen and empower at the right time, not to tell people what to do.
Is there a danger, though? I'll accept that we don't believe the state's the bearer of solutions to complex social problems anymore. And even if it had solutions, we might not like them, and we wouldn't want them to give them to us, right? Because we don't think that they necessarily have the only voice in the definition of the problem, let alone in the rolling out of the solution. But is there not a danger that if we say we want to devolve these responsibilities outwards to civil society, that somebody might not come along and say that, this might be just state retreat. This might be the privatization of what in fact are public policy issues. And how do we counterbalance that argument? Because it still remains the legitimate business of government to support sustainable futures, and especially in the context of climate change. And in a Welsh context, that's embedded now in legislation. So how do we deal with that criticism?
I think it's always a risk, particularly as this happens to be coinciding with a period of public finance constraint,
Retrenchment,
where it's very easy for this to be presented as actually backing off and over to you guys. So I think it does depend very heavily on trust, and it isn't about over to you guys. This is how we can help you, how we can work with you to make this possible, and you can work with us to make this possible.
Is society ready for that?
Well, I think this is why we can't. You were saying earlier, there's a danger of interdisciplinary sustainability science being too hollowed out and flimsy. But I think it's the opposite. I contend it's the opposite. What we need to rethink political theory. Actually, I've come to the conclusion, because what we're dealing with here is new roles for the state and the market and civil society, and designing new ways in which they can work much more reflexively. And the climate change and the resource depletion problem has now got so great that it's really impacting on science in a new way. And but it's highly contested. It's highly contested about what the solutions should be. So if you take the city-region framing, one dimension of that, it might be a dominant dimension, is a very neoclassical view of the city region. That all you need to do is agglomerate things in a city region, and you'll solve your problems, and you'll have economic green growth. And then there's the regenerative city objectives, which are saying, well, hang on, where's the circular economy in all this? How do we get a much more efficient system of waste reduction, carbon reduction, transition to a post-carbon world within the context of a framing of city regions or catchments?
Let alone what's the distributive impacts of a model, of a neoliberal model, in terms of a country here that's still predominantly rural.
Exactly.
And where you have profound pockets of poverty.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm actually glad now you've raised that, because there are those questions of ethics and moral values and codes. And very earlier on, you said that to you the implementation and the playing out of sustainability acts only in a way that's meaningful when you think about it in a place context. And my mind just suddenly thought, well, actually sustainable development is also about normative principles and values. It's about inter and intergenerational equity.
Yes.
It's about the precautionary principle. It's about principles of justice and fairness.
Yes.
And now you've put those on the agenda. How do we deal with those? Because there really are very complex trade-offs here.
We've enshrined them in the legislation, which is at least a start. So I mentioned the 7 goals. The 7 goals are effectively our expression of the values to which we're subscribing as public bodies in Wales through the legislature. So in a sense, we've got the start of that. We've also got the 5 behaviours, which enshrine those ways of working, including the futurity, including collaboration, including engagement, including integration between different areas and disciplines. Having said that, of course, doing it, actually challenging the public sector with that obligation, is going to be fantastically hard and fantastically complex. The principles are simple, the operation of them are very challenging.
What would they fear most?
What would they fear most? That's a very interesting thing. I don't think it's about fear. I think it's about moving out of a set of accountabilities that you've got now that are very clear and very Victorian. They're about being charged with doing specific things and spending public money properly. It's a very simple test.
It's
important, but it isn't actually related to achieving anything.
Okay.
And the ability to get into the space where we're spending public money properly to achieve positive change in the round for society and the things we value is what we're charging people with. So the big thing for me, the first thing about this legislation, is that it's saying you can't say this isn't something that you have to take account of. You can't continue to say this is not my responsibility. It might not be your direct thing that you're legally charged with, but in the way you exercise those functions, you have to contribute to the whole, and you have to contribute to the long term, and you are charged intellectually to do that, and you are charged to specifically set out what you plan to achieve through what you do against those 7.
Yep.
And not just achieve, but to maximise. So our goal, in a way, is to rethink the way we look at public service, to optimise the activity of the public sector in terms of achieving sustainability.
And is sustainability science comfortable with that idea that we have values and that they're an important part of what it is that we do?
I think it's a very innovative experiment what's going on in Wales in this regard, because what Matthew's describing is enforcing with the key public sector bodies, including Cardiff City Council and all of the councils and local government bodies in Wales, be charged with addressing these issues. So they're not going to be able to avoid addressing these issues in a more reflexive way. So it's a very interesting experiment, I think quite unique in terms of moving from what was traditionally over the last 15 years a statutory obligation to a situation now where you are essentially delivering expectations within the public sector. So for instance, in the city region of Cardiff, the local authorities are going to have to respond and to be answerable and accountable for sustainability, not just for their economic local government expenditure or finance, in a sense. So it's going to be very interesting to see how, let's say, the city region of Cardiff responds and the public bodies respond to that process. And a subject of study, actually, and an evaluation.
What can sustainability science, what can social science, what can we contribute to that? All these years that we have studied in environmental social science, either from geography or from sociology or from political science, anthropology, there's a huge body of literature out there now. What can we contribute?
Well, I think one of the things we can do is we can set up longitudinal, temporal-based studies of places, of local authorities, what are often called deep places or local places, which are not just about examining what's going on, but helping these organisations at lower level than Welsh Government to see how it can address this post-carbon transition in a context when you've got extreme economic austerity at the same time. In many of these places, many of them are sort of post-industrial anyway, and they're struggling with public sector cuts. So you've got a perfect storm of problems within which you're trying to develop a post-carbon transition, and that's a real challenge. So I think as social scientists, or sustainability science, you've really got to take forward more creatively the notion of co-production and work with these communities and organisations to see how you can develop case studies of best practice and then translate that best practice to other places or disseminate it in ways which communicate that practice to others where it's not been thought about in some respects. So it raises some really interesting questions about comparative local place analysis of what's going on, really, I think, in this transition. So, a very ideal scenario would be a research project where we took various places in Wales to test out how this response, how they were responding to the 7 principles that are now established.
I think one of the other things we could contribute is to let us all know, not just the system of public administration, but to keep reminding ourselves too about the illusion of rationality, the delusion of it as well. That we do have both a model of science and a model of how the system of public administration works that's built upon 19th century understandings.
I'm going to pull this lever here and something down there will happen.
Billiard ball models of society and administration. And it's not so much that we point this out, but that we also point out the danger on the continuous belief in this. Because if we continuously argue that we have a billiard ball model or a pull a lever model, then we don't make space for reflection or for taking account of unintended consequences or for the inherent uncertainty and the inherent risk in what it is that we're doing. Do you want to hear this message, or do you think this message is something that is too tricky
No,
to take
it's,
on
it's
board
a really
now?
important message. I think it's a difficult political message
Okay.
because it is very seductive to be able to say, I can solve your problems.
Yes.
I have the answer to this.
Yeah.
But I think increasingly people in society know that that's illusory. So I think that sense of what is it we're working towards. I think I haven't particularly mentioned the concept of resilience, which I think is very important here, because in a set of uncertain futures and complex systems, things that increase our ability to adapt, that increase either the social capacity or the natural capacity to adapt to different challenges, I think is fundamental. So anything we should be doing, we should do, ought to contribute to increasing resilience of social and natural systems, economic systems. I think if we fail to do that, then we're definitely failing against these tests.
What would you say to a social scientist who says resilience is not a good feature of our society because our model of economic development has proved terribly resilient? The neoliberal model, we have certain regimes, I'm thinking of Syria, that has proved very resilient, and that in and of itself resilience might be good in a natural system because it's understood to be the continuous functioning and structure and composition of that system. When it meets external stressors, it tips into a new state, but that state continues to have functionality and structure. In a social science context, we might not always feel completely comfortable with that idea that resilience is a good property of the system. What would you say to
Well, I would
social scientists
disagree
who would say that?
personally.
Yeah.
We need to have a debate about that. I would disagree that neoliberalism is a resilient system. I
Okay.
think it's in crisis.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to last. I think what we're doing in Wales in a policy sense is very innovative and post that regime in many respects. And I think there's a lot of literature out now to suggest that that's a battle we're in. That's the sort of world we're in. We're living in a world where we're in a system which is crisis driven, and we're trying to generate something which is more resilient in that sense. And I don't think neoliberalism is going to deliver that. I think we need to think through, for instance, new framings around urban-rural functionality. For instance, the old model is one of, in Wales, is your rural areas about the extractive economy. Take things out, take resources out, carbon resources. No better examples than what was here historically, and it's still living with the legacy.
Yes.
And so the new model is a new set of functionalities between increasing urbanisation and what the rural hinterlands can deliver in terms of ecosystem services, sustainable ecosystem services. So the whole equation between urban and rural is up for discussion in this process, and that's why notions of city region need to take that on board in a sense. So I think in terms of where we're going, it's sort of equivalent but much more profound than when it was in the mid-19th century when Marx and Engels were debating about urban-rural transitions then, about how on earth we were going to feed the growing urban industrial population in 1870. Marx wrote to Engels and said, how are we going to do it? We need soil fertilisation and so on.
Science,
now
yes.
we've got the problems are even greater because we've got this limit, earthly limit on what we can do.
I suppose in a way the problem with resilience is that it's used across an awful lot of disciplines and also has a popular meaning. So it probably doesn't help us much more than using sustainable in a sense. But just that sense of doing things that are likely to work in a number of future scenarios, I think is really, really important and really different.
That's a really useful way of thinking about it, because we do tend to hop onto words, don't we?
Yes.
And they become too stretchy and they become quite meaningless almost
again,
in the end.
It's place-based again, isn't it? In a sense, the resilience in Wales would be a different type of resilience set of parameters. It's somewhere else. So this is the other challenge for sustainability science, is that there's no one model, you know, that what happens in Wales might not work in Latvia or in the Netherlands.
And yet at the same time, we have to think about that planetary boundaries, those planetary scales, not, you know, that idea of finding a safe operating space for humanity within the context of planetary boundaries. So is that up and down between scales again?
It is really tricky. I mean, what we've done within the legislation in the Environment Act, we have a State of Natural Resources report, which the Natural Resources Wales produces. We then produce a national statement of priorities for natural resources for Wales as a whole. But then that is translated through the area statements, which are bottom-up documents that reflect the opportunities and places there. So we're trying. It's difficult. I mean, there isn't a right answer to this because you want it to be as real and local as possible, but you do have to set some sense within that. Not least because one of the things we haven't touched on, particularly with place and placemaking, is redistribution. And if you simply sit with places as they are, they've got the capacity and the ability that they have, and sometimes you need to bring other things in. You need to provide new opportunities from elsewhere, and that's redistribution has always been a function of government.
Yes, yeah.
I think it's really important to distinguish place-based perspectives from localism, actually. You know, that we're not denying here the significance of systems. That, you know, if you're organising a transport system, you're organising a healthcare system, or whatever it is, you need to think different scales.
Economies of scales come in as
well.
well.
We're not saying localism is everything and localism is good and sustainable. That's not what placemaking is about. I think it's about recalibrating the equations between what you can do externally, internally within places in new sorts of ways, and how you can balance the exogenous with the endogenous, if you see what I'm saying, in terms of places, and how certain places, things can happen better in certain places, but also capture things that are off. And that's where the city region sort of framing is quite interesting, because clearly, you know, let's say Cardiff City region wants to be a growth region, a green growth region. It wants to be attractive globally as a city, etc. And balancing those sorts of economic, and Wales as a whole, you know, balancing those economic development goals, relating around resilience to sustainability is the holy grail, really.
It is, isn't it?
It means you have to look at new forms of economic model development as well.
And new ways of measuring what constitutes progress, which is what one of the interests is here with the well-being of future generations.
Indeed, in terms of, and I'm just going to pick up one of the words I really hate in the debate here is balance.
Okay.
And trade-offs, that sort of language.
Why do you hate that language?
Because it means each one is coming from a sense of competing for attention within its sector, or and I think that sort of sense of framing this so that the whole moves forward, so that you're looking for things that not only work in the present and the future, but also work to broad benefit. So that's where a lot of the sort of discussion around the green growth models and things like that. So how do you conceive a prosperous society that is based on low carbon, that is based on the sort of things we've talked about in the session so far? What are that's still a positive outcome for people. It needs different inputs and different ways of working, but it isn't balancing stuff off. It's a different way of achieving the values that we have as society.
It does really require a very fundamentally different way of thinking, doesn't it? Because trade-offs are what we have in front of us at the moment, given the way the system works. For example, you know, we would struggle to have ecosystem service delivery in the same time as having the promotion and protection of biodiversity, for example. You know, that's a trade-off. It isn't necessarily the case that if we have good ecosystem service provision that we'll protect biodiversity, because we can have a simplified system that provides us with good ecosystem service delivery, but not with biodiversity. That can exist in trade-off. Right? Rural development policies can also exist in trade-off with biodiversity.
I don't think there is this. Well, a trade-off is interesting. I mean, it's not trade-off in a sense. It's just it's failed to deliver the other thing at the same time, isn't it? That's not trade-off. That's.
Can it deliver the same thing, both at the same time?
Yes. I don't think there's any. Well, it has to. Otherwise we're all doomed in a longer sense. I mean, because we have to live within our basic means.
Okay.
And we seem to be happy to have that discussion about our financial means. We seem slightly unwilling to have that discussion about our environmental and social constraints here. So,
that's an interesting way of thinking, that you're driven by this idea that we have an imperative to make it work.
Yes, I think we do.
Yeah.
Yes.
And now it's a question of finding the ways to catch up with it.
Yes.
So that's a very value-driven.
Yes.
Yeah, that brings back to our question that we had a while ago in our discussion about values,
Yes.
the importance of values in shaping our understanding of the future. You were talking earlier on about values as well, about
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. It raises questions about the style of research that research we do. I think where we have to be, as Andrew Sayer and people argue, we have to be more normative. We have to be explicitly normative and honestly about those normativities.
Yeah.
So we have to say, look, this is one sustainability outcome. This is another. And we have to weigh up the balances or the relativities between these different options and put those out into the world. Yeah. But they are value driven. So our sustainability science is it confronts openly the question of norms and values. It has to do that because I think it's embedded within sustainability. If you deny sustainability the values, you are watering down sustainability significantly.
I think so too.
And that's what's happening in many cases.
Yeah.
We're in a world where sustainability is discussed everywhere.
It's
Resilience is discussed everywhere.
Yeah.
The reality, the real sustainability is about putting those values into...
It's about the normative principles that underpin it.
Yeah, and that's we're confronting that with our PhD students now when they're doing PhDs. Clearly they've got to be rigorous, they've got to be scientifically valid, but they've also got to have normative, they've got to deal with these wicked problems, or else it dilutes the whole work that they're actually doing.
And that also seems to be where Wales is at the forefront, isn't it? It's got a value-driven public policy agenda or imperative.
Yes, and I think the previous one was sort of one planet living was the description, and the one of the goals that we've got is about being a globally responsible nation in terms of the impacts that we have worldwide in terms of what we do here. So that's really important to us, and I do think that being clearer about the norms, about the values is really important. I think too many things happen through assumption and implicitly rather than explicitly. Biodiversity is an interesting one. I mean, we consciously adopted the International Convention on Biological Diversity in terms of the legislation, which starts with this is an issue of societal choice.
Yeah.
And also stresses the importance of indigenous knowledge and engagement and subsidiarity in dealing with these issues. And actually that's as true in social terms, I think, as it is in ecological. I think to be express about that, because I think a lot of people, and certainly a lot of either specialists or lobbyists, aren't express about the value system that they're working to, and that you get messages that don't have implicit values that they're not surfacing, and it makes it really difficult.
Of rationality and objectivity that hasn't really helped us to confront our own approaches and ways of doing.
Though there is a very logical and rational argument about why it's not a good idea to use more resources than the planet's got, and in terms of even classical economics and the rest of it, there is a circular economy and not producing waste that can't become anything is not a good plan.
Even from rational economic terms.
Very rational.
I mean, you would argue, Nick Stern would argue that.
I guess I was using the word rationality in the sense of sort of presumptions of linearity and causality, rather than the rational economic man. You're actually quite right. That classic rational economic man in neoclassical economic theory is the one you have in mind here, and for that one would be entirely irrational to use up land, labour and capital to total depletion. Right? Unfortunately, it's the land bit that was underdeveloped in that theorising.
Yes.
Yeah, it was assumed as free
from
resource.
quite a lot, in almost all of the classical economics and indeed the Marxist economics, it's the bit that's not really there properly. I would argue, and it's just taken as a free good, which at the time probably was not an entirely unreasonable position to be in, although it probably
was, if you think of it from a global perspective, it probably was entirely unreasonable.
Yes. But in a colonial context, yes, indeed.
I think it clearly challenges us as scientists to. We are still in a unique position, despite what I've said about values, because I think we have to maintain an independence and an ethical code, which is perhaps more complex. Whereby we're dealing with a variety of different stakeholders who in many cases have different perspectives and more narrower perspectives on these things. So it challenges us in a research ethics sense to be careful about our independence and our positionality within this context, because we've got a particular role to play which can bring these agencies together in various ways, but to respect the fact that they've got different perspectives and angles on this. In this plurality.
But we're not in too bad a place now, because we look back in academia over the last 20, 25 years, especially in the social sciences, we've very much got our head around the idea of strengthening our ethical codes of conduct and ethics in research as an integral part of the training of a PhD student, that they do learn, a social science understanding of
there is some interesting issues
research
there,
conduct.
Because a lot of this area, both the environmental and social sciences, then are pushed into observer and describer, potentially rather than actor.
And we've been quite clear not to allow that to happen, certainly in some of the schools in Cardiff University, but also in some of the academic associations, and the way in which they've uptaken that issue of ethics is that we've made sure that it doesn't restrict our role and our agency within that. Okay. Although there are tensions.
Some tensions here, aren't there? Because you are wanting to change. Simply through the collaboration and engagement and cooperation, you are changing the thing that you are engaging with. And that's always interesting. Now, for us, there's a greater legitimacy, I sense, in that one thing that governments do have some legitimacy in is to convene. And I think increasingly in this context, our role is there to bring people together, particularly people who don't otherwise get together. And a lot of our work, I think, over the last year has been around bringing together groups who might represent different parts of those trade-offs of which you were speaking, and to get them to understand their different issues.
Is that enough role for government? Because there is this argument that the state is now moving into this meta-governance role, and that it's the governor of the governance system, and that it's coordinating and facilitating all this interface. But the government also has other roles. You've already mentioned distribution, redistributive roles. And I guess the question is, would you be happy that the role was collapsed into a coordinating role? Or has it got other roles as well?
I think, in many ways we're trying to understand the concept of state in this era, aren't we? I think, and it's brilliant. That's why we've got so much either devolution or decentralisation globally, of which this institution is one, because we're trying to understand what works in a world where our issues are increasingly both very global and very local, and your traditional your construct of the nation state from the sort of post Waterloo, whatever, from that sort of period is a particular point in time, and is probably not, in one way or another, fit for purpose in the challenges. So whether that's the move towards more local approaches, or the school of new medievalism that in political science, where you're looking at the re-emergence of natural geographical linkages, the old city-state, polycentric government, all these sort of things. So we were all experimenting. We were all trying to understand what our role is. I think the problem with where we are at the moment is that there are these huge expectations placed on the traditional state to be the answer to things. And that's quite disabling for everybody in a strange way, and particularly in the context of sustainability.
I mean, you know, we are where we are. We've got these institutional structures, nation states and devolved states and so on, and you can't ignore them. They're important players, as the, you know, the implementation of the future generations is going to be delivered through that sort of thing. But it shouldn't deny the you know, if we could find a way of reflexively building in a much more flexible scalar approach, so that, you know, we're incorporating, we're sensitive to catchments, so we're sensitive to city regions, we're sensitive to, you know, smaller communities, and that you have this flexibility in there. And if the political system and the state system can manage that process, then you know, that's part of it. And I think for scientists, it's also a way of demonstrating. The 15 projects we're dealing with on this program are all taking different framings, actually, of what that sustainability is. So, you know, down to individuals, leadership, for instance, to community, to city regions, to villages or eco-villages. And I think that, you know, for me, the future is about an orchestral approach to all of those sorts of things. You know, it's not it's, as you say, it's beyond the Westphalian nation state, but the nation state's still going to be there in some form.
You've still got the conductor.
You've still got the conductor.
And the orchestra.
But the more responsiveness and deliberative approaches, the better, it seems to me. That seems to be a lesson that we're learning in political science as well.
Yes, yeah, although political science is struggling with the notions of democracy and deliberation and participation, because the models of democracy are mapped onto older models of the state, and they're jarring now.
The older models of accountability and transparent delivery, and I think, I mean, a lot of those are really complex. I was musing, one of the things we've experimented with is our little Cynefin projects, where we've put people into communities without a program attached to them. They are there simply to help those communities to do something that community wants to do that will be good for that community. And the impossibility, really, of evaluating, accounting for, you know, because they were there to do good. And there's a huge irony. There's a huge irony in that. And that really, for me, that sort of sense of how do you, you know, that you've got a system that doesn't allow you to account for doing good. I think there's a real opportunity for the participants in this program in looking at the way they frame and pursue the PhD opportunities they've got here, because this is cutting edge stuff in terms of thinking. It's a real opportunity to join between disciplines and issues, and I think that opportunity to challenge the framing of the way they're looking at the topics, and to make connections, interdisciplinary connections, scale connections around that, I think is really wonderful, and it's a really exciting time. It's very current for us, and I'm sure we're going to learn a lot from talking to the PhD students as part of this program. That's why we're participating in it, because it's very alive and very important for society as we go forward, and the more impactful these pieces are, and the more this equips the PhD students with the sort of rounded skills that we've been talking about, the better from that perspective.
And in one sense, what we've said here is about their responsibility to society, their responsibility to the co-production of knowledge with the partners on the issues that they are going to address, which are, as you've just said, across scale, and looking from the local right up to the regional, and their sense of obligation and partnership in the co-production of that. But I'd also say to them that they also need to follow their heart too. You and I are sitting here, and we both can tell stories about when we started to work on the environment and thinking about it from a multidisciplinary perspective. We were warned off by our professors. I remember my professor saying to me, "There's no future in the environmental area. There's nothing to research." A minority sport, you were told.
Yeah, I was told.
And here we are, and we see that it's at the forefront, but we don't know what the new forefront is.
Well, I think
after that, we have to hand over to them.
I think from the 70s, 80s onwards, I mean, we've grown up our careers have grown up through the environmentalisation of social sciences, which has been really a critique, really, in many respects. And now we're at a point when we're at the top of the hill. You know, we can see the devastation of the last 20th century, and we're looking forward, but it's cloudy down there, and we need a new science which can help to not to jettison everything from the past, but to reconceptualize and recalibrate and redesign models of development. Actually, a lot of what we're talking about this afternoon is about development, actually. It's about resilient development and development pathways. So in a sense, I think that's a new terrain. It's a contested terrain, but it's nevertheless a terrain where rigorous science is needed to bring together a much more balanced approach between policy and science.
And I think that is the key. It's about the rigor, but it's also about not being afraid to think outside the box think differently. Because
think about the small things that are happening, not just the macro things. You know, the small things where you see something innovative working, which might be very minor, maybe very small, but it can go
and your
viral
professor
in
may
today's
say
world.
to you that it's it's a minority sport. Don't believe them.
And challenge us and challenge us as hosts because we don't know how to do this.
We just know we don't know. At least we're admitting that. That's an important step, isn't it? Yeah.